And now to the latest in the continuing fallout over the nationwide college admissions scandal. UCLA men's soccer coach Jorge Salcedo has resigned from his position 9 days after being charged by prosecutors for his alleged involvement in the scheme.
According to the indictment, he helped facilitate the admission of 2 students under the guise of being soccer recruits, although neither of them played the sport. This, as an op-ed in the Washington Post, argues that Americans with disabilities are the biggest victims of the college admissions scandal. Some involved with the scheme allegedly used rules in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act to help some students cheat on college admissions tests.
So Rebecca Cokley wrote that article, and she joins us now. She's the director of the Disability Justice Initiative at the Center for American Progress. Thank you so much for joining us, Rebecca.
Thank you so much for having me today.
So you say that it's the Americans with disabilities that have been also exploited by this scheme. Explain that.
Definitely. Well, in order to procure extra time on these tests, those are considered reasonable accommodations, which is actually a term from the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And those are provided if somebody is able to document need for that given a formally diagnosed disability. In the case of them getting extra time, they may have a vision impairment that might require the test to be read aloud. It may require special use of a computer or other kinds of software to ameliorate their dyslexia or whatever it might be. And as we saw in this case, Singer, who was the fixer for a number of these families, were telling the parents to sit down with their children and tell their children, act dumb, act disabled.
Yeah, and you know, that bothered me in particular because when you talk about disabilities, you're not talking about being mentally insufficient.
It's not intelligence, right?
You know, and we had talked earlier, and I was talking, Vlad, about my best friend in college who was studying to get into medical school. She only had 95. She was on the dean's list. It wasn't until sort of halfway through college she realized that she was suffering from dyslexia and could take advantage of some of these opportunities. Her intellect was way up there, way past mine.
Well, and they're not even necessarily opportunities, but these are civil rights.
Right.
These are. This is not giving folks with disabilities an advantage over non-disabled people.
Yeah.
These are accommodations that you should have access to be able to level the playing field. Just like for me as a person with a visible disability, to be able to have pedal extensions on my car so that I could drive just like one of you, that doesn't mean that I can drive 100 miles an hour down 6th Avenue.
Right.
It just means that it gives me equal access to people without disabilities.
And so a lot of people mistake or misunderstand what this actually means. They think that somehow people with disabilities are able to get into schools much easier than people who don't have disabilities. And that's not certainly the case, as you write in the op-ed.
No, the standards for students with disabilities are the exact same standards as students without disabilities.
So then why would then a parent say, or this guy who was the fixer say to somebody who didn't have a disability, let's pretend that you do, because this will facilitate your entry into an elite school?
Well, and with this case in particular, I mean, they had a whole system set up. They had doctors involved that were writing diagnoses. They had proctor, they were sending you to their exam facility once you had the documentation, where they were then able to either tell you the answer or doctor the answers. This was a Ponzi scheme of civil rights in so many ways, that from soup to nuts, the system was set up to provide these students that, as far as I can tell, the only thing they've been documented as having is affluenza, with inequitable level of access compared to their peers.
And Rebecca, it's something we were talking about earlier in relation to this and a lot of other things, right? I think sometimes people think, well, you know, we passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and 65, the Voting Rights Act, we emancipated the slaves, so, you know, we've gotten rid of this problem, it's all good. And it's the same thing, I think, with this act, right? People seem to say, well, you know, we passed the Americans with Disabilities Act, and so what's the problem? We are now, we've leveled the playing field, right? Haven't we, Rebecca?
And we talked about this earlier. The New York City subway system is a great example. We saw a woman die this year trying to access the subway because we know that a majority of the subway stops here in the city are still not accessible, and the ADA is approaching 30 years old. It's middle age, and we're still not in compliance. And people think that we have all these freedoms, we have all this access, but if you can't access basic things like transportation or healthcare, you can't choose where you live. You can't choose where you work. You can't choose where you go to school, because all of these things are impacted by having a lack of access.
Are you concerned that when people hear about this scheme, they will be more likely to question others with disabilities that maybe visually you can't tell?
Oh, we've already seen it. I think any time that non-disabled people take advantage of disability rights laws, the blowback comes on our community. I mean, we see it with the opioid crisis right now, where there's this push to limit medications to as few as only 3 days or 7 days, where if you have a lifelong debilitating condition, what does that mean for you when that's a part of your pain management, not part of an addiction? And so we're yet again seeing, because there is a number of bad actors, the blowback impacting our community writ large.
Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
It's another
Really
important voice in this story.
Really important. I'm glad you're here. Thank you.
Thank you.